Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Louisiana. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing what places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. The St. Martin Parish Courthouse archives contain a peculiar gap in their records from the spring of 1843 to the late summer of 1845. For decades, this was dismissed as damage from humidity or perhaps the chaos of record-keeping in pre-Civil War Louisiana. But in 1962, during a renovation of the courthouse basement, workers discovered a sealed metal box behind a section of brick wall that appeared newer than its surroundings. Inside was a collection of handwritten accounts, official documents, and a leather-bound journal with its cover stained dark around the edges. The county clerk who first examined these papers requested they be sealed again and stored separately from public records. They remained untouched until 1965, when Professor James Whitmore of Tulane University gained temporary access for what he described as historical cataloging purposes. The documents were never publicly released. In 1968, a small fire in the archive's storage room allegedly destroyed several boxes of historical materials, including, according to official reports, this collection. However, Whitmore's detailed notes survived, and they tell the story of what local residents once called the Bride of Bayou Teche, a tale that was deliberately struck from official history. The story begins with a name, Madeline. According to the 1900 census of most common female names in Louisiana, Madeline ranked 27th in popularity. In the spring of 1843, Madeline Reynolds arrived in St. Martinville, a small but prosperous settlement along Bayou Teche, approximately 15 miles from New Iberia. She came as the new bride of Harold Walker, owner of Oak Shadow Plantation, one of the largest sugarcane operations in the parish. Harold Walker was 47 years old, a widower for the past 3 years. His first wife, Caroline, had died from what the local doctor recorded as excessive melancholy, leading to physical decline, a common diagnosis for what we might now recognize as severe depression. Walker had traveled to Charleston, South Carolina 4 months earlier and returned with a new bride nearly half his age. By all accounts recovered from correspondence and the few journal entries from neighboring plantation wives, Madeline was described as exceptionally comely, with a peculiar intensity to her gaze. She was educated, well-spoken, and seemed to adapt quickly to her role as mistress of Oak Shadow, despite having no previous experience managing a household of such size. Oak Shadow employed 48 enslaved people, an unusually high number for a plantation of its size, according to tax records from the period. Harold Walker had a reputation for acquiring troubled labor, purchasing enslaved individuals with histories of escape attempts or resistance at reduced prices. In a letter dated April 7, 1843, Margaret Beauchamp, wife of a neighboring planter, wrote to her sister in Baton Rouge, "The new Mrs. Walker has taken to her duties with unusual zeal. Harold appears most satisfied with his selection, though I confess there is something in her manner that leaves one feeling as though one has been assessed rather than conversed with. She asks questions that ladies seldom concern themselves with about the management of field hands and disciplinary measures." The plantation overseer, a man named Thomas Hebert, had been employed at Oak Shadow for 11 years. According to testimony later given to the parish sheriff, Hebert initially found Madeline's interest in plantation operations unsuitable for a lady of her station, but Harold insisted he answer any questions his new wife might have. During her first weeks at Oak Shadow, Madeline was observed spending long periods walking the property. She showed particular interest in the far eastern edge, where the cultivated fields gave way to cypress swamp. This area, locally known as le fin de la terre, the end of the earth, was considered unusable land, where the plantation's boundary dissolved into the murky waters of the Bayou. The first unusual incident occurred approximately 6 weeks after Madeline's arrival. An enslaved woman named Ruth, who worked in the main house, reported to Heber that several items had gone missing from the kitchen, specifically a large butcher's knife, rope, and a bottle of the laudanum that Harold used for his recurring gout pain. Heber later recalled that when he mentioned this to Madeline, she seemed unconcerned, suggesting that perhaps one of the housegirls misplaced them during cleaning. No search was conducted, and the matter was apparently forgotten. In early May of 1843, a field hand named Solomon was reported missing. Solomon had been purchased by Walker the previous year and had already attempted escape twice. His disappearance was not initially treated as unusual, and Walker ordered the customary search of neighboring properties and the posting of a $20 reward for his return. After 3 days with no sightings, Hebert organized a more thorough search with dogs. The hounds followed Solomon's scent to the edge of the swampland, but refused to go further, becoming agitated and uncooperative. This was noted as strange, as these same dogs had previously tracked runaways deep into swamp territory on other occasions. Harold Walker, according to Hebert's journal, was prepared to accept the loss and file an insurance claim for the escaped property. It was Madeline who insisted the search continue. In what was described as an unusual display of feminine determination, she personally offered an additional $30 from her own dowry funds to anyone who could locate Solomon or provide information about his whereabouts. No one claimed this reward. Solomon was never found. 3 weeks later, another disappearance occurred. This time, it was a house servant named Mary who had been attending to Madeline's personal needs. According to kitchen staff accounts, Mary had been summoned to Madeline's private sitting room the evening before she was discovered missing. No one reported seeing her leave the main house. Unlike Solomon, Mary had no history of escape attempts. She had been born on the plantation and had family among the enslaved community, a mother, 2 sisters, and a young child of 4 years. When questioned by Hebert, Madeline claimed she had dismissed Mary early as she had a headache and desired solitude. She expressed surprise at the woman's disappearance and suggested that perhaps Solomon had returned and convinced her to leave with him. The search for Mary was less vigorous than for Solomon. Without a history of flight, she was initially presumed to be hiding somewhere on the property, possibly afraid of punishment for some unknown transgression. After 5 days, Harold Walker considered the matter closed and assigned another house servant, Esther, to replace Mary in attending to Madeline. It was around this time that the first reports of strange sounds coming from the swamp began to circulate among the enslaved population. Several field hands claimed to have heard a woman's cries coming from deep within the cypress trees after sunset. Hibbert dismissed these accounts as superstition, noting in his journal that the Collards have become excessively agitated by these disappearances and are now finding frights in every night sound of the Bayou. By mid-June, the atmosphere at Oak Shadow had changed perceptibly. According to correspondence from neighboring plantations, the field hands were working with unusual silence, and productivity had increased despite the summer heat. Hibbert noted with satisfaction that punishment incidents had decreased by nearly half. When Harold's brother, William Walker, visited from New Orleans in late June, he commented in a letter to a business associate that Harold's new bride has brought a remarkable discipline to the operation. The Negroes seem almost fearful of disappointing her, though I have not witnessed her employ any unusual methods of correction. William also mentioned that his brother appeared somewhat diminished since his marriage, describing him as quieter than I recall, and seemingly content to defer to Madeline's judgment in matters I would have expected him to control firmly. He noted that Harold had developed a persistent cough and had lost weight, which Madeline attributed to the summer, humidity aggravating his constitution. On July 2, 1843, a field hand named Isaac failed to appear for morning roll call. Isaac was described in plantation records as strong-willed but reliable and had been at Oak Shadow for 7 years. His disappearance marked the third in less than 3 months. This time, Harold Walker ordered only a cursory search of the immediate property before declaring Isaac a runaway. According to Hebert's journal, Madeline showed little interest in this latest disappearance, merely commenting that the heat and work drive some men to foolish decisions. What happened next is documented in the most disturbing section of the recovered materials, several pages from Madeline's personal journal, which she apparently began keeping shortly after arriving at Oak Shadow. The handwriting is precise, almost architectural in its formation, with no flourishes or embellishments typical of women's penmanship of the era. The entry dated July 7th reads, "Harold continues to weaken despite the tonic. He questioned me about the noises from the eastern marsh last night. I told him it was merely alligators in their mating season. He seemed unconvinced, but too fatigued to pursue the matter. The tincture I have added to his evening brandy ensures he sleeps deeply enough not to be disturbed when I attend to my night work. The last one was difficult, stronger than anticipated. I will select more carefully next time." By mid-July, reports of unusual sounds from the swamp had become common enough that even neighboring plantations had begun to take notice. In a letter to her cousin, Elizabeth Comeau, whose family owned land adjacent to Oak Shadow's eastern boundary, described the most unsettling wails carrying across the water after midnight. "The sounds are such that our dogs howl in response and cannot be quieted. Our overseer insists it is only herons or perhaps a panther, but I have lived beside this swamp my entire life and never heard its like." On July 23rd, Harold Walker took to his bed with what was described as a wasting fever. The local physician, Dr. Samuel Wilson, was called to attend him, and Wilson's notes, which were among the recovered documents, indicate he suspected consumption, noting the patient's severe weight loss, persistent cough, and occasional presence of blood in the sputum. He prescribed rest, beef broth, and a standard laudanum mixture for pain and sleep. What Wilson found more noteworthy, however, was Madeline's behavior. In a personal letter to a medical colleague in New Orleans, Wilson wrote, "The new Mrs. Walker displays none of the distress one would expect from a bride of scarcely 4 months whose husband lies potentially dying. She receives my instructions with perfect composure and administers his medicines herself, refusing even the assistance of house servants. Most peculiar was her singular question, whether, in my opinion, a body buried in swamp water would decompose more rapidly than one in dry soil. She claimed the question related to a novel she had been reading, but I confess it left me discomfited." During Harold's illness, no further disappearances were reported among the enslaved population. Heber noted that work continued with unusual efficiency, and the enslaved people now moved in groups, never allowing anyone to be alone, particularly near dusk or when working closer to the swamp boundary. By early August, Harold's condition had deteriorated significantly. Dr. Wilson visited every 3rd day, but his notes suggest he had little hope for recovery, writing on August 9th that the patient's decline accelerates beyond expectation. Mrs. Walker reports administering the prescribed treatments faithfully, yet I observe no improvement, indeed quite the contrary. On August 15th, Harold Walker died in his bed at Oak Shadow Plantation. The official cause was recorded as consumption, though Dr. Wilson privately expressed some reservation about the rapid progression of the illness. Madeline arranged for a modest funeral, citing her husband's supposed wishes for simplicity, and Harold was buried in the small Walker family cemetery on the plantation grounds. With Harold's death, Madeline inherited full control of Oak Shadow, as the couple had no children and Harold had no surviving male relatives in Louisiana. His brother William, who might have contested the inheritance, had returned to New Orleans and, according to correspondence, had himself fallen ill with what was described as a similar wasting condition shortly after his visit to Oak Shadow. It was after Harold's funeral that the most disturbing pattern of disappearances began. Between late August and early October of 1843, 5 more enslaved people vanished from Oak Shadow. Unlike the earlier cases, these individuals had no history of escape attempts. They included an elderly man who had been at the plantation for over 20 years, a pregnant woman within weeks of her delivery date, and a 14-year-old boy who worked in the stables. Hebbert's journal entries from this period reveal increasing concern not only about the disappearances but about Madeline's management style. He wrote on September 12th, "Mrs. Walker insists on personally selecting which hands will work the eastern fields each day, a task previously left to my judgment. Her selections seem to follow no pattern I can discern, sometimes choosing the strongest, other times selecting those who have shown the slightest infractions in their duties. Those chosen often return from their day's labor with a strange quietness about them, and I have observed that within a week of such special assignment, they frequently vanish." By October, rumors had begun to spread beyond Oak Shadow. The parish sheriff, James Collins, received an anonymous letter claiming that murder most foul occurs at the Walker plantation, with the enslaved being slaughtered by the mistress's own hand and fed to the creatures of the swamp. Collins dismissed this as malicious gossip, likely from a business rival of the late Harold Walker, but did make an unannounced visit to Oak Shadow on October 10th. Sheriff Collins' report, found among the recovered documents, states that he found nothing unusual at the plantation. He described Madeline as a gracious widow, managing admirably in difficult circumstances, and noted that she gave him a complete tour of the property, including the slave quarters, where he was free to speak with anyone. He did remark that the Negroes seem unusually subdued, though well-fed and without visible signs of harsh treatment. What Collins did not include in his official report, but mentioned in a private letter to Judge Martin Voorhees, was that he declined Madeline's invitation to inspect the eastern boundary of the property, citing time constraints. He admitted to the judge that something in the lady's too eager suggestion that we walk to the swamp's edge left me with a profound reluctance to do so. I cannot explain the sentiment except to say that as we stood on the veranda looking toward that cypress line, I felt I was being measured for something other than my official interest. The day after Sheriff Collins' visit, an enslaved man named Daniel disappeared. Daniel had been one of the individuals the sheriff had spoken with during his inspection. According to accounts from other enslaved people later collected by Hebbert, Daniel had told the sheriff that conditions at Oak Shadow were as well as could be expected, but had added, though some who go to work by the East Marsh never return to tell what they've seen. 2 days later, the overseer Thomas Hebert himself vanished. This disappearance could not be explained away as an escape or typical plantation incident. Hebbert was a free white man, respected in the community, with family in nearby New Iberia. His absence was noted when he failed to appear at a scheduled meeting with cotton factors in St. Martinville on October 14th. When questioned by a hastily formed search party of neighboring planters, Madeline claimed that Hebert had resigned his position following a disagreement about plantation management. She produced a letter, allegedly written by Hebert, stating his intention to seek employment in Mississippi. The handwriting was later questioned by Hebert's brother, though no formal investigation was pursued at that time. The search party, led by Frederick Beauchamp from the neighboring plantation, insisted on examining Oak Shadow thoroughly, including the slave quarters and outbuildings. They found nothing unusual, though several members noted the extreme reluctance of the enslaved people to speak with them, even when Madeline was not present. Beauchamp later wrote to Sheriff Collins, expressing his concerns. The entire plantation operates under a pall of silence that I have never before witnessed. The field hands work with their eyes downcast, speaking not even among themselves. Most troubling was our approach to the eastern boundary, where the property meets the cypress swamp. As we neared that line, our guides became so visibly distressed that 2 women fell to their knees, refusing to proceed further. When pressed for explanation, they would say only, "That's where the mistress takes them." The search party did not venture into the swamp itself, as dusk was approaching, and none were familiar enough with that particular section of Bayou to risk darkness there. They agreed to return the following day with boats and additional men. That night, according to statements later collected, strange lights were observed moving in the swamp, and the sounds, described variously as wailing, screaming, and a woman singing in a foreign tongue, were heard by neighboring plantations as far as 2 miles away. The following morning, when Beauchamp returned with a larger party, including experienced swamp guides, they were met at Oak Shadow by a scene of bizarre emptiness. The main house stood with its doors open. No servants attended the grounds. The field hands were not at their morning stations. The entire enslaved population of Oak Shadow Plantation, 39 people at that time, was gone. So was Madeline Walker. The search party proceeded cautiously through the abandoned property. In the main house, they found evidence of hasty packing, drawers left open, certain valuables missing. In Madeline's private sitting room, the searchers discovered a hidden compartment beneath a floorboard containing a small leather-bound book, several unusual implements described as foreign in design, possibly African in origin, and a collection of small cloth pouches containing what appeared to be human teeth, hair, and bone fragments. The journal, which comprises a significant portion of the recovered documents, revealed the true horror of what had transpired at Oak Shadow. Written in the same precise hand as the earlier entries, but now, filling page after page with increasingly disturbed content, Madeline's writings detailed a calculated campaign of ritual murder. She described selecting victims carefully, observing them for signs of physical strength or spiritual resistance. She wrote of luring them to the swamp's edge under various pretexts, usually a special assignment from the mistress that could not be refused, and then subduing them with drugged water or, in cases of larger men, having them struck from behind with a weighted club as they worked. The most disturbing passages detail what she called the feeding, elaborate rituals conducted in a small clearing deep within the swamp, accessible only by a narrow, winding trail that she had discovered and widened during her early explorations of the property. Here, according to her writings, she would bring her still-living victims and perform a series of ritualized cuts, bleeding them slowly into the dark waters while reciting what she called the old words my grandmother taught me in Charleston. Madeline claimed in these writings that her grandmother had been brought to South Carolina from Haiti during the revolution there and had passed down secrets of controlling spirits and binding human will. She wrote that each feeding made her stronger, while simultaneously weakening those who remained at Oak Shadow, making them more compliant and less likely to flee or resist. The journal's final entry, dated October 15th, 1843, the day after Hebert disappeared, reads, "They know now. I saw it in Beauchamp's eyes today, that flicker of realization beneath his performance of concern. The swamp has whispered to them, or perhaps Hebert did not die as quickly as the others. No matter. I have taken enough to complete what I began. Harold, his brother, 9 of the strongest among the slaves. Their essence flows in my veins now. Tonight, I will call the remainder to the water's edge. Those who are worthy will become my instruments. The rest will feed what grows beneath the cypress roots. By dawn, we will be gone from this place, moving west along the water paths where white men fear to follow. In the territories, we will find another plantation, another master in need of a wife. And we will begin again." The search party, upon reading portions of this journal, immediately formed a larger expedition to enter the swamp area at the eastern edge of Oak Shadow. Local guides and experienced hunters led them through the difficult terrain, following what appeared to be a recently used trail. After nearly 2 hours of careful progress through the cypress and standing water, they reached a small island of relatively dry land. What they found there was described in a sworn statement by Frederick Beauchamp, the only written account of the discovery that survived. The clearing contained evidence of repeated horrific activities. A large cypress at its center had been modified with iron spikes and hooks driven into its trunk at various heights. The ground beneath was stained dark in a wide circle. Personal effects, a shoe, fragments of clothing, a carved wooden pendant known to have belonged to the house servant Mary, were found scattered at the edge of the clearing. Most disturbing was the discovery, partially submerged in a pool of stagnant water, of what our guides identified as a gris-gris of tremendous size, a ritualistic object consisting of a burlap sack containing various items. When examined, this sack was found to hold human remains, specifically severed hands, at least a dozen by our count, in various states of decay. Among them, based on a distinctive gold ring still on one finger, were the remains of Thomas Hebert. The search continued for 3 days, expanding outward from this clearing, but no further sign of Madeleine or the missing enslaved people was ever found. The prevailing theory, as recorded in Sheriff Collins' final report, was that Madeleine had led them westward through the interconnected waterways, possibly heading toward the less settled areas of Texas. A warrant was issued for Madeleine Walker on charges of murder, but she was never apprehended. Reports of similar disappearances and strange occurrences surfaced periodically over the next decade in western Louisiana and eastern Texas, but none were definitively linked to her. Oak Shadow Plantation was eventually sold at auction to cover Harold Walker's outstanding debts, as his estate had been severely mismanaged in the months before his death. The new owners reportedly refused to cultivate the eastern section bordering the swamp, leaving it to return to wilderness. In 1862, during the Civil War, the main house of Oak Shadow was burned by retreating Confederate forces to prevent it from being used as a Union headquarters. The property was subsequently divided and sold to multiple owners after the war, and the name Oak Shadow was deliberately retired. Local histories of St. Martin Parish, written in the late 19th century, make no mention of the Walker case or the disappearances at Oak Shadow. It was as if the entire incident had been deliberately expunged from community memory. Professor Whitmore's notes from his 1965 examination of the documents conclude with a disturbing postscript. During his research, he attempted to locate descendants of the families mentioned in the case, the Walkers, Heberts, Beauchamps, and others. While tracking these genealogical lines, he discovered an unusual pattern. In the decades following the Oak Shadow incident, an unusually high number of prominent men in the region died from what was described as wasting illnesses, similar to Harold Walker's symptoms. More striking was that many of these men had, shortly before their decline, married women with limited or unverifiable backgrounds. These marriages were typically brief, the husband rarely living more than a year, and the widows tended to leave the area shortly after settling their inheritance. Whitmore's final note reads, "While investigating these patterns in Natchitoches parish records, I encountered a request for marriage documentation from a woman seeking to prove her great-grandmother's union to a plantation owner in 1857. The woman provided her ancestor's portrait, hoping it might assist in locating relevant records. The daguerreotype, though faded, shows a woman with a striking intensity to her gaze that I found immediately familiar from descriptions in the Walker documents. Most disturbing, though, was the name provided, Madeleine Hebert. She could have been 60 or 70 years old by then, yet the woman in the image appears no older than 30. I have not shared this discovery with the woman who provided the portrait, who now resides in East Texas. I have, however, noted that her family has prospered unusually well over generations, despite beginning with seemingly limited resources. The fire that allegedly destroyed the original Walker documents occurred 3 months after Whitmore completed his examination. Whitmore himself died less than a year later from what his physician described as rapid onset consumption, the same diagnosis given to Harold Walker 125 years earlier. To this day, locals near the former Oak Shadow property report unusual sounds from the cypress swamp at night, what some describe as a woman singing in a language that makes the skin crawl. Fishermen avoid certain passages of Bayou, claiming the water there feels wrong and that fish caught in those sections often contain strange objects in their stomachs, buttons, metal fragments, and occasionally what appear to be small human bones. Perhaps most unsettling is a pattern noted by several historical researchers, but never formally studied. In communities across Louisiana, Texas, and as far west as Arizona, there are occasional reports of a woman with eyes that never seem to age, who appears in towns experiencing economic growth, typically marrying a prominent widower before disappearing after his untimely death, leaving no trace but a series of unexplained disappearances among the community's most vulnerable. The last verified report matching this pattern occurred in a small mining town in eastern Arizona in 1958. A wealthy mine owner married a woman who called herself Madeleine Beauchamp, claiming to be from New Orleans. 6 months later, he died of an undiagnosed illness. 3 workers from his mine disappeared, and Madeleine Beauchamp vanished, leaving behind only a small leather-bound book that was destroyed in a house fire before authorities could examine it. The Louisiana swamps are deep, and their waters keep secrets well. What feeds beneath the cypress roots remains unknown. But in certain parishes, parents still warn children to come home before dark with the caution, "Don't linger near still water at dusk, or the bride of the Bayou might take a liking to you." What the recovered documents from 1965 failed to fully explain was the fate of the 39 enslaved people who disappeared from Oak Shadow that October night. Local folklore maintained that they had been victims of Madeleine's final feeding ritual, their bodies disposed of in the deep pools of the cypress swamp. However, Professor Whitmore's extensive notes include interviews with elderly residents of St. Martin Parish conducted in the early 1960s, which suggest a more complex truth. According to these accounts, for years after the Oak Shadow incident, there were sporadic reports from hunters and trappers who claimed to have encountered ghost-like Negroes deep in the swamplands between St. Martinville and the Atchafalaya Basin. These individuals were described as wild-eyed and speaking in tongues, living in makeshift camps that could be quickly abandoned. They reportedly fled from any white person who came near, disappearing into waterways where few would follow. One particularly detailed account came from Etienne Mouton, a Cajun trapper who, in 1851, claimed to have stumbled upon a hidden settlement approximately 17 miles southwest of the former Oak Shadow plantation. In a statement given to a traveling Methodist minister and preserved in church records, Mouton described finding a collection of huts built high on stilts above the water, connected by plank walkways that could be quickly pulled up. He observed approximately 20 individuals, including women and several children, who appeared to have been born in the years since the Oak Shadow disappearances. Most disturbing in Mouton's account was his description of the community's apparent leader, a tall, straight-backed woman with skin the color of aged cypress, who the others treated with a mixture of deference and fear. When she noticed Mouton watching from his hidden position, he claimed she turned directly toward him and smiled, revealing teeth filed to points like those of an alligator. Mouton immediately fled, becoming lost in the swamp for 2 days before finding his way back to civilization. When he later led a small party of men back to the location, they found only the charred remains of stilts protruding from the water and a strange symbol carved into a nearby tree, described as a spiral with small marks like fingers reaching from its center. This account aligns with an unusual notation in Madeleine's journal, previously considered indecipherable by Whitmore. On the page dated September 3, 1843, beneath her regular entry, Madeleine had drawn a similar spiral symbol and written, "The worthy will not feed the water, but become its voice. The blood gift ensures loyalty beyond death's threshold. Grandmother's promise holds true. Those who drink both waters can never truly leave my side." This cryptic reference suggests that Madeleine may have been engaging in some form of ritualistic control over certain chosen individuals from among the enslaved population, those she deemed worthy in her writings. Rather than killing all who disappeared, she may have been inducing a form of psychological dependence through drugs or other means, creating followers who would assist in her activities and eventually flee with her. Further supporting this theory are records from the Louisiana State Hospital in Jackson, dated 1872, documenting the admission of a man found wandering in the Atchafalaya swamps by lumber workers. The man, estimated to be in his 50s and identified only as John, was described as being in a state of extreme physical deterioration, with numerous ritual scarifications covering his body. He spoke little, but hospital staff noted that he repeatedly made the same disturbing claim, that he had been bound to the swamp bride by consuming a mixture of her blood and water from the feeding pool. He claimed he had escaped after 26 cycles of the moon, when the woman's attention was focused on preparing a new husband. The patient died 3 weeks after admission from what was determined to be advanced tuberculosis. The examining physician noted that the man's internal organs showed signs of prolonged poisoning, possibly from repeated exposure to toxic substances found in certain swamp plants known to cause hallucinations and physical dependency. In 1878, an article appeared in the New Orleans Daily Picayune describing the discovery of what was called a cult encampment in the remote marshlands of Calcasieu Parish, approximately 100 miles west of St. Martinville. Local authorities, investigating reports of cattle theft, found evidence of recent habitation, including unusual artifacts: crude dolls made of Spanish moss and bone, containers of stagnant water mixed with unidentified substances, and a leather-bound journal containing entries written in a cipher that was never successfully decoded. The most significant connection to the Oak Shadow case came from an elderly woman living near the site, who claimed that for several years she had occasionally traded food and supplies with a composed and well-spoken colored woman who would emerge from the swamp every few months. The woman, who never gave her name, always asked detailed questions about wealthy widowers in the region, showing particular interest in their health, assets, and family connections. She was always accompanied by at least 2 men who stood silent as statues, their eyes never blinking, with strange markings cut into their arms. The final documented connection to Madeline Walker appears in the 1889 journal of Dr. Ellis Montgomery, a physician in Beaumont, Texas. Montgomery recorded treating a woman who identified herself as Madeline Beauregard, claiming to be the recent widow of a cattle baron from Louisiana. Montgomery noted that despite claiming to be in her 60s, the woman appeared remarkably youthful, with only the faintest lines around her eyes and mouth. She sought treatment for a persistent cough, which Montgomery diagnosed as early consumption. What drew Montgomery's attention, however, was the woman's unusual request for information about local mining operations and their owners. When he inquired about her interest, she explained that she was considering investment opportunities following her husband's death. Montgomery, who had family connections in Louisiana, became suspicious when he noticed a distinctive ring on the woman's finger, a gold band with an unusual pattern that matched the description of a ring known to have belonged to Thomas Hebert, the overseer who had disappeared from Oak Shadow 46 years earlier. In his journal, Montgomery wrote, "Upon observing the ring and making a casual reference to St. Martin Parish, I noted an immediate change in the woman's demeanor. Though her expression remained pleasant, something in her eyes became calculating, measuring. She inquired as to my family connections in Louisiana with unusual intensity. I fabricated a distant relation rather than revealing my cousin's marriage into the Beauchamp family, whose plantation neighbored the infamous Oak Shadow. As she departed, she paused at the door and said, 'Doctor, you have the look of a man who would benefit from swamp water tonic. It preserves the constitution remarkably well.' The statement was delivered with such knowing menace that I found myself unable to sleep that night. The following morning, I made inquiries about Mrs. Beauregard's residence, only to find she had departed town before dawn, leaving no forwarding address. Montgomery's journal entry is the last credible historical record that can be potentially linked to Madeline Walker. However, local histories throughout East Texas and western Louisiana contain scattered references to a woman matching her description appearing periodically in remote communities through the early 1900s, always following a similar pattern: marriage to a wealthy, usually older man, his subsequent illness and death, unexplained disappearances among local workers or servants, and the woman's eventual departure with a small group of devoted followers. The most intriguing aspect of these accounts is the apparent age of the woman, described consistently as appearing to be in her late 20s or early 30s, despite the passing of decades. This impossibility has led most historians to dismiss these as separate incidents involving different women, perhaps even deliberate mimicry of the notorious Bayou bride legend. However, those familiar with the original Oak Shadow documents note the consistency of specific details across accounts separated by both time and distance, details that were not included in any publicly available records of the case. Professor Whitmore's final notes on the Oak Shadow investigation, dated just 2 weeks before his own death in 1966, contain a troubling personal admission. I have become increasingly convinced that my research has drawn unwanted attention. Twice in the past month, I have observed a woman watching my home from the street, a slender figure who never approaches, but stands motionless for hours. Yesterday, my housekeeper reported that while I was at the university, a well-dressed woman, claiming to be a former student, requested access to my study to leave a gift. When refused entry, she left a small package containing a cloth pouch of the type described in the Walker documents, filled with what appears to be soil and water from a swamp. Enclosed was a note reading only, "Curiosity fed the historian to the water. I have decided to conclude my research immediately and have arranged for my notes to be sealed upon my death." Whitmore died 3 days later after a rapid decline that his doctors could not explain. The official cause was listed as pneumonia, but the attending physician noted the unusual presentation of symptoms, including darkened veins visible beneath the skin and the persistent odor of stagnant water that seemed to emanate from the patient's pores despite repeated bathing. In 1982, during construction of a pipeline through St. Martin Parish, workers uncovered a collection of human remains approximately half a mile from the former eastern boundary of Oak Shadow Plantation. Archaeological examination determined the remains belonged to at least 7 individuals, all showing signs of sharp force trauma consistent with ritual sacrifice. Carbon dating placed the time of death in the mid-19th century. Most notable was the discovery, among the bones, of a gold wedding band engraved with the initials HW and a date, March 12, 1843, the day Harold Walker married Madeline in Charleston. The most recent connection to the Oak Shadow case emerged in 2002, when a historian researching antebellum plantation records discovered a daguerreotype in the archives of the Louisiana Historical Society. The image, dated 1842 and labeled simply Charleston Debutante, shows a young woman with striking features and the intense gaze described in accounts of Madeline Walker. What makes this image particularly disturbing is its provenance. It was donated to the society in 1971 by a woman named Madeline Heber, who claimed to have found it among her grandmother's possessions. Attempts to locate this donor revealed that the address provided was a cemetery in New Orleans' Garden District, and the plot number corresponded to a grave that, according to records, had remained empty since its purchase in 1868. The name on the deed for this burial plot, Madeline Walker. In the years since Professor Whitmore's investigation, the legend of the Bride of Bayou Teche has persisted in Louisiana folklore, evolving from historical accounts into cautionary tales told to children and eventually into the stuff of campfire stories and local ghost tours. The actual documents relating to Oak Shadow, if they still exist, remain hidden from public view, perhaps deliberately sealed by those who fear what deeper investigation might reveal or what it might attract. What is perhaps most disturbing about the Walker case is not the historical horror it represents, but the possibility that it never truly ended. Every few years, local newspapers in small towns across the American South and Southwest publish brief reports of a similar pattern. A charismatic woman with no verifiable background marries a wealthy widower. Local workers or vulnerable residents begin to disappear. The husband dies of a wasting illness. The widow vanishes with a small group of devoted followers. In 2012, police in a small Arizona mining town investigated the disappearance of 3 migrant workers and the suspicious death of Harold Reinhardt, a 78-year-old mine owner who had 6 months earlier married a woman who called herself Madeleine Beauchamp. She claimed to be 32, but, according to the town's sheriff, looked like she hadn't aged a day past 25. By the time authorities connected the pattern to previous incidents, Madeleine had vanished, along with Reinhardt's personal assistant and 2 household staff members. The investigating officer noted in his report that Reinhardt's home had a room that had been converted into what appeared to be some kind of shrine, with dozens of small glass bottles containing murky water, soil, and what the forensic lab later confirmed were human teeth and bone fragments. Written in what appeared to be dried blood on the wall above this collection was a single phrase: "The water never forgets those who feed it." In the wake of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, as waters receded from flooded sections of St. Martin Parish, local residents reported unusual discoveries in areas that had been submerged for generations: rotting wooden platforms built on stilts deep within previously inaccessible sections of swampland, strange symbols carved into the trunks of ancient cypress trees, and most disturbing, a series of small islands in the deepest parts of the swamp where the soil was unnaturally dark and nothing would grow. Soil samples taken from one such location by an environmental assessment team revealed abnormally high concentrations of iron, consistent with large quantities of blood, having saturated the ground over time. The geologist who analyzed these samples noted something else: the presence of a unique organic compound that could not be immediately identified. Further analysis by a university laboratory determined it to be a complex mixture containing elements of human blood, swamp water, and extracts from several plants known for their psychoactive properties, including some that are not native to Louisiana. The compound, when tested on laboratory rats, induced an unusual state of heightened suggestibility, followed by intense dependency on the substance. Animals deprived of it after repeated exposure displayed extreme aggression, self-mutilation, and behavior that the researchers described as ritualistic. The study was discontinued after the lead researcher began exhibiting similar symptoms, allegedly after accidentally ingesting a small quantity of the compound. In her final research notes before being committed to psychiatric care, she wrote, "The water speaks. She is its voice. Those who drink forget everything but her will." Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Madeleine Walker case is how deliberately it seems to have been erased from official history. The documents discovered in 1962 and examined by Professor Whitmore before their alleged destruction represent the only detailed record of what occurred at Oak Shadow Plantation. All other contemporary accounts, newspapers, court records, parish registers, contain conspicuous gaps, precisely where information about these events should appear. This systematic erasure suggests not just the usual historical suppression of uncomfortable truths, but something more deliberate, as if those who knew the full extent of what happened feared that preserving the story might somehow preserve Madeleine herself, keeping her alive in memory, if not in fact. The question that has haunted researchers for decades is not just who or what Madeleine Walker truly was, but whether she represents a historical curiosity or an ongoing threat. The pattern of appearances matching her description across nearly 180 years defies rational explanation. Yet the consistency of details in cases separated by vast distances and decades suggests something beyond mere copycat crimes or folkloric evolution. In Professor Whitmore's final notes, he proposed a disturbing theory. What if the rituals Madeleine performed in the swamp were not merely sadistic murders or expressions of a deranged mind, but part of something she genuinely believed would grant her extended life? And what if, more terrifying still, they worked, not through supernatural means, but through some horrific combination of compounds found in the unique ecosystem of Louisiana's swamps, combined with human biological material in specific proportions? What if she discovered, through her grandmother's teaching or her own experimentation, a substance that could dramatically slow cellular deterioration at the cost of regular feedings of fresh human tissue? This would explain her apparent agelessness, her pattern of movements, the disappearances that always surround her, and her preference for wealthy husbands who could provide both social cover and the financial means to continue her work. This theory, while seemingly fantastic, finds unexpected support in recent scientific research. In 2018, a team studying extremophile bacteria in Louisiana swamps discovered microorganisms that produce compounds with remarkable cellular preservation properties. When applied to human tissue samples in laboratory settings, these compounds dramatically slowed deterioration rates and showed potential for preserving neural function. The researchers noted that similar bacteria, in combination with certain plants found primarily in the Gulf Coast region, could potentially create substances with even more dramatic effects. Their paper, published in a respected scientific journal, made no mention of the Madeleine Walker case or Professor Whitmore's theories. However, one of the lead researchers was found to have downloaded all available information about the Oak Shadow case from university archives shortly before beginning the study. 3 months after the paper's publication, this researcher resigned her position and disappeared. Her current whereabouts are unknown. Local law enforcement agencies throughout Louisiana and neighboring states maintain no official files on the bride of Bayou Teche or Madeleine Walker. When questioned, representatives typically dismiss the story as folk legend or urban myth. However, veteran officers in certain parishes have been known to quietly track cases that fit the pattern, keeping unofficial records and occasionally warning colleagues in other jurisdictions when similar incidents begin to unfold. One such officer who requested anonymity stated in a 2019 interview, "We don't talk about it officially, but every few years something happens that fits. Woman appears from nowhere, marries into money, people start to vanish. By the time anyone connects the dots, she's gone. Different name each time, but always some variation of Madeleine. Always that same pattern of disappearances, always that same description. Young-looking, intense eyes, way of speaking that makes people do what she wants. We've started to notice a geographic pattern too. She moves along waterways, never staying more than a year in one place, always heading west for a while, then circling back to Louisiana like she needs to come home to the original swamp. Like she's feeding something there that keeps her going." In October of 2021, a real estate developer purchased a large tract of land in St. Martin Parish that included the former eastern boundary of Oak Shadow Plantation. During preliminary environmental assessment, workers discovered a series of underwater structures in the swamp area that appeared to be the remains of wooden platforms, similar to those described in Etienne Mouton's 1851 account. Further investigation revealed a small island deep within the cypress stand that contained what archaeologists identified as a ritual site dating to the mid-19th century. Most significant was the discovery of a sealed metal container buried beneath a large cypress tree at the center of this island. Inside was a leather-bound journal with a note affixed to its cover. The note, dated October 15, 1843, the day of Madeleine's disappearance from Oak Shadow, read, "To whoever finds this record, I leave it knowing that none will believe what is written here, yet feeling compelled to provide some warning to those who might follow. What began in Haiti with my grandmother's learning and continued through my work in these waters creates something that cannot be undone. The feeding must continue, and I must return to this place periodically to renew what sustains me. Those who drink the mixture become mine beyond death's reach. Those whose essence feeds the water become part of what empowers it. I have selected my worthy ones from among the enslaved, and we depart tonight for new territories. But I will return to these waters when necessary, as I must. The cycle continues as long as I do, and I have now taken enough to last many lifetimes. Judge me not by the morality of ordinary existence. I transcended those limitations with my first feeding." The journal itself reportedly contained detailed instructions for creating what Madeleine called the water of extension, a complex process involving human blood, specific swamp bacteria, plant extracts, and ritual timing. Before archaeologists could fully document these contents, the container and journal disappeared from the secured university laboratory where they were being studied. The graduate student who had been transcribing the text vanished the same night, along with all digital copies of the material. 3 months later, police in East Texas investigated the disappearance of 3 immigrant workers from a small town near the Louisiana border. They had last been seen in the company of a well-dressed young woman who had recently arrived in the area, claiming to be researching local history for a university project. According to witnesses, the woman had been particularly interested in properties with access to natural water sources and had spent considerable time asking about wealthy, elderly residents in the region. The investigation remains open. The woman has never been identified. Perhaps most disturbing of all the theories surrounding the bride of Bayou Teche is the possibility that Madeline Walker was not unique, that she passed her knowledge and techniques to selected followers over the decades, creating a lineage of brides who continue her practices into the present day. This would explain the impossibility of a single woman appearing unchanged across nearly 2 centuries, while accounting for the consistency of methods and patterns. If this theory is correct, then the horror of Oak Shadow Plantation never truly ended. It merely transformed, adapting to changing times while maintaining its essential nature, the systematic sacrifice of human life to sustain something that should not exist. The swamps of Louisiana are ancient and deep. Their waters hold secrets that science is only beginning to understand. In remote areas where cypress trees have stood for centuries, locals still report hearing strange sounds at night, sometimes described as singing, sometimes as crying, sometimes as the voice of a woman calling names in the darkness. Fishermen occasionally find unusual objects tangled in their lines when they venture too deep into certain backwaters: buttons, jewelry, once even a gold wedding band engraved with the initials HW in St. Martin Parish. There is a section of Bayou Teche that local guides refuse to enter, even in daylight. They will not explain why, beyond vague references to bad water or the place where she fed. Maps of the area show nothing unusual, but satellite imagery reveals a subtle anomaly. A perfect circle of darker vegetation, approximately half an acre in diameter, centered on what appears to be a small island. One researcher described finding cellular material that doesn't correspond to any known plant or animal species indigenous to the region, almost as if the water itself had developed a biological signature. Perhaps most telling is the local custom, still observed in certain parishes, of placing small offerings, usually food or flowers, but sometimes personal items like hairbrushes or clothing, at the edge of swamplands on October 15th, the anniversary of Madeline's disappearance from Oak Shadow. Environmental scientists who have analyzed water samples from this location note unusual chemical compositions and unexplained organic compounds that do not match typical swamp ecology. When asked about this practice, elderly residents simply say, "to keep her fed and away from our doors." The true legacy of Madeline Walker may never be fully understood. Historical records remain fragmented, deliberate obfuscation obscures the facts, and those who investigate too deeply often find themselves abandoned by colleagues who fear association with folklore rather than serious history. Yet the pattern persists, appearing with disturbing regularity across time and distance. A young woman with intense eyes, a wealthy husband who wastes away, disappearances that go unexplained, and always proximity to water. For those who have studied the case most thoroughly, one question remains paramount. If Madeline or her successors still exist, still practicing the techniques described in those recovered documents, who feeds the water now? And what does it feed in return? In certain parishes of Louisiana, parents still caution their children to stay away from the water's edge as darkness falls. They warn them not to listen if they hear a woman singing in the twilight, and never, under any circumstances, to drink from still water in the swamp, no matter how clear it might appear. They tell them the story of the bride of Bayou Teche, not as legend or campfire tale, but as living history, a danger that has never truly passed. And in their telling is the unspoken fear that somewhere in the darkness of the cypress swamp, Madeline Walker still waits, her hunger undiminished by time, the water ever ready to receive her offerings. The most recent chapter in this dark history may be unfolding even now, in some small town near a body of still water, where a woman with intense eyes has just arrived, asking questions about local wealth and promising remedies for ailments that conventional medicine cannot cure. Listen carefully when you stand at the water's edge. Some say that if you remain perfectly still, you can hear whispers beneath the surface. Voices calling names that have been forgotten by all but the water itself. They say that the swamp remembers everything it has consumed, and sometimes, in the deepest part of night, it speaks through a woman's voice, reciting the old words that Madeline's grandmother brought from Haiti so long ago. The water never forgets, and neither, it seems, does she.